Dan Rather reporting from CBS News World Headquarters in New York with Ed Bradley at my side here now. It's 2 in the afternoon on the U.S. East Coast, and the focus is turned back to Boston, where 2 of the hijacked flights began. Within the hour, law enforcement SWAT teams were seen swooping into the Westin Hotel. We were told there were no arrests, although there is one report out there that an arrest was made. But our information is there's been no arrest confirmed. The police and FBI were searching a hotel room and some adjacent rooms that may have been used by suspected hijackers. This kind of thing may be happening quite a lot in succeeding hours and days as the FBI and other law enforcement agencies look for clues to people involved in these terrible acts of this week. Here's what else is happening. The confirmed death toll in New York still stands at 41, but thousands of civilians and hundreds of uniformed officers, including police and firemen, are still missing. The FAA ban on civilian air traffic, which was to have been lifted at noon Eastern Time, still stands. Now, keep in mind the FAA just within recent minutes says they are keeping the ban on air travel for at least the rest of this day. Major League Baseball has announced the schedule is scrapped for tomorrow, the 3rd straight day that baseball's been shut down. Watching the search here in New York is our 60 Minutes colleague, Ed Bradley. Ed?
Dan, one thing that we've been able to get for certain is that 2 of the suspects involved in this terrorist attack did fly to Boston from Portland, Maine. And interestingly enough, they used New Jersey driver's license as identification on those flights. And I think that there's a connection there because the World Trade Center bombing, I think 8-9 years ago, some of those suspects were also based in New Jersey. There's also one report that, quoting an anonymous source, said that the suspects purchased one-way tickets, that they used cash to do that they arrived late at the airport, and that they appeared to be Middle Eastern. All of those are red flags for security personnel, but no one picked up on it.
And in Lower Manhattan at this hour, we may or may not be able to show folks the pictures of it, that the pace of the effort to remove the debris, the steel and the concrete to get at the dead, and also to see if any more people can be found alive, as some have been found alive over the last 18 to 20 hours.
This is going to be an ongoing effort for months to get to the bottom of this debris. I mean, unlike Oklahoma City, where you had 9 stories that came down, and given that, it was relatively easy, or certainly much easier to pick through it. You've got 2 buildings here, 100 stories each that came down.
And a 3rd building, 47 stories.
That's a lot of rubble to go through. And it is going to be an ongoing process. We're going to be seeing this going on in New York for months to come.
Let's check in with Bob Orr in Washington for the very latest on the air traffic situation. Bob?
Dan, I think we have to be a little careful. There is genuine confusion, even in the ranks of the FAA, about what is going on. Here's the facts that we know at this moment. The ban, which was imposed yesterday, the FAA said would last at least until noon today. Obviously, now we know it's gone on well past noon. And the latest word I have is it will continue indefinitely. Nobody that I know at the Department of Transportation or the FAA has said to me, at least, that there's no chance there is not a flight that will leave later today. They're leaving open, I guess, that possibility. Where the confusion comes in is there are some airlines around the country that have put out tentative plans for a resumption in scheduled service. I know Alaska Air has been quoted. I've seen some reports about American Airlines. I think what's going on here is these are airlines saying, if we get the green light, we're ready to go with limited service. But I would emphasize, at this moment, as far as I know, there is no plan to lift the ban. That could change in the next hour, it could change in the next day. But there are significant discussions still underway about how to balance this issue of security versus the economic necessity of having a viable air transport system. Dan?
Well, Bob, clarity is among our top 3 or 4 priorities always, and one has a deep understanding of the problems facing the FAA, but can we get some clarity? It's somebody somewhere in the FAA at some point this afternoon going to speak candidly, directly, and frankly about what the situation is, and with some definition, because there are literally tens of thousands of people sort of waiting for the word.
Absolutely correct. I mean, this is a paralysis that's kind of set in. And frankly, I will tell you from sources at the FAA, it's not the Federal Aviation Administration calling the shots. I mean, I guess somebody may argue that at the moment it doesn't seem that anybody is, but the FAA is taking its marching orders from the Department of Transportation. Now, I can tell you this. This morning, there was a plan for the Department of Transportation Secretary Norm Mineta to come out to announce whatever the resumption was going to be. That was put on hold until President Bush spoke. And then after the president spoke, suddenly and mysteriously, the Mineta briefing was canceled and never rescheduled. I think there is genuine disagreement, within the ranks of the government about what's the best course of action. And I think for the moment, caution is winning the day here.
Well, Bob Orr, I don't want to belabor this, but would someone at the White House, if not President Bush himself, somebody at the White House, or is it procedure to eventually call the Department of Transportation and or the FAA and say, in effect, get your stuff together and tell people what's going on? Because we've had first one thing, then another, then a reversal. Right. We've had all kinds of U-turns in this situation.
Oh, I agree. I mean, clearly the White House can make the call here. I think they're caught up in a situation, Dan, and I'm not making excuses for them because I think there's going to be plenty of time to review their actions here. But I think they're caught up in a situation where we've never had a national ground stop before. This impacts hundreds, thousands of flights, hundreds of thousands of passengers, and it's not quite as simple as throwing the green light and having everything back to normal, because right now there's no real definition of normal. Will the FAA come out at some point this afternoon? I certainly hope they do, because there are a number of questions, and this ambiguity certainly is not helping anybody.
Bob Orr, we have video now of New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani holding up what he says is one of the flight recorder boxes recovered from the debris around the World Trade Center. If this turns out to be the case, this is a big breakthrough for investigators. Now, I'm told we have a technical problem with the videotape. Can't play it for you just yet. But this would be, if not a bulletin of the hour, certainly an urgent on anybody's news wire, that Mayor Giuliani says and holds up what he says is one of the flight recorder boxes. We'll be trying to show you that video shortly. Let's go to former Defense Secretary Bill Cohen in Washington. Secretary Cohen, what do you make of the developments over this last hour?
Well, Dan, I'd like to come back to a colloquy that you had with Ed Bradley a moment ago. And being a former politician, I want to say I agree that with both of you. I agree with you, Dan, that there's undoubtedly some daddy warbucks involved behind the support of these organizations, or this particular one. But I think Ed Bradley also has a point. This was not necessarily a very expensive operation to conduct. Maybe the training of the pilots, should they have been trained here in the United States, but it's possible that you had some pilots from various countries who were recruited, already trained. It doesn't take very much to look at the schedules of the aircraft, to have a flight leaving from the East Coast to go to West Coast, to have a full load of fuel. And third, it doesn't take a great deal in terms of manpower as such to pull such an operation off. So we've had government report after government report talking about the laxity at our airports. And so this could be carried out with a relatively little amount of money involved, other than perhaps a promise of a payment to the families of the people who conducted these particular suicide missions in order to compensate their families. But this is not necessarily a major expense involved. So I think that ultimately there is somebody with money behind this, but this could be carried out with little expense involved. Secondly, I was interested in your discussion, Ed, earlier about is there another shoe to drop? And this is something we have to keep very much in mind as the FAA and others are struggling to make sure that we have the kind of security measures put in place. That this, in dealing with terrorists, you're talking about the squeezing of a balloon. As soon as we really clamp down, and we need to clamp down much more so than we've done in the past, on airport security, they're likely to move to other modes of transportation, other types of targets. They are predators. They will look for the weakest link, and they will surveil, they will watch, they will patiently wait and analyze and make their plans accordingly, and then go for where you are most vulnerable. So even as we beef up the security at our airports and the procedures we adopt for our flights, domestic and international, we still have to be on the alert that there are going to be other attempts in different types of formats. Third point I want to make is the question about intelligence failure. Yes, to the extent that this was allowed to take place, you can mark that as a failure. Perfection is not possible in our lifetimes in virtually any endeavor. Certainly that's true of the intelligence community. But the intelligence community does an extraordinary job, and there have been many, many cases where they have in fact interrupted and foiled terrorist attempts and activities, resulting in the arrest of the individuals involved, but also the disruption of the actions themselves. One of the things that will be interesting is you and your colleagues are now looking for more and more facts, more details to piece this together as to how it occurred. Because we live in a free and open society, because we have a free and unfettered press, you are going to demand more details. To the extent that we publicize them, this will educate the terrorists of tomorrow. They will see what mistakes were made, what traces of evidence were left behind, and be sure not to repeat them again in the future. Third point to make on the intelligence matters. Every time we have someone who has access to classified information who makes an announcement on national television about certain information, how it was collected, once again, this creates a problem for the intelligence community, so that those terrorists who have been communicating a certain way decide that that's no longer feasible or desirable for them to do so, and they adopt alternate methods. And then finally, we also have the issue of traitors. We know that we've had the case with both Hansen and Ames, that when we develop people on the ground, and now the call is for greater and greater human intelligence, and we need that. It takes 10 to 12 to 15 years to get good agents in the field. Very difficult in dealing with the countries that we're talking about. And so we have to focus more on their development, but we also have to realize that we have developed agents in hostile environments. We've had them rolled up, so to speak, ultimately murdered as a result of leaks coming out of our own system and traitors within. So it's a very difficult challenge for the intelligence community. We have to do better, and I'm sure that the Congress is going to appropriate more dollars to put more agents in the field, more training, greater collection, but we have to understand that perfection is not possible in our system, or any for that matter.
Former Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen, who is now a CBS News consultant for us on this story. I want to pause. We've made a mistake. I've made a mistake. I'd rather be dragged behind a horse than be inaccurate. But the responsibility for this is mine, and blame is mine. I said a moment ago, a few minutes ago actually, that we had video of Mayor Rudolph Giuliani holding up one of the flight recorders recovered from the debris at the World Trade Center. That is absolutely unequivocally false. That did not happen. We don't have any such video, and I apologize for the mistake, and you can be assured that I'm redoubling my efforts and our efforts not to make that kind of error again. The mayor did hold up a photograph of flight recorders, but there's no flight recorder has been recovered so far as we know, and I do apologize to you for that mistake. Let's go to Scott Pelley, who's reporting from near the site of the World Trade Center. Scott?
Dan, I'm standing between the two towers, what's left of the two towers. Just a few minutes ago, a fireman carried in a large ornamental American flag, the kind with the gold braid around the edges, and he climbed up to the top of this mountain of debris where I'm standing. Protruding from that mountain of debris is a mast, a tower that appears to be the tower from the #1 building, the tower that was on the very top of the building. He climbed that mast and unfurled this flag. The Stars and Stripes, Dan, are now waving in the air, in the gray, dirty air that's blowing through here. A number of firefighters watching that scene wept. Everyone stood at something like attention. And the flag is now flying over this scene of terrible devastation. Land of the free, and if any place is the home of the brave in America, it is this spot at this time. Dan?
Scott, it's Ed Bradley. Have you talked to anyone there who has any hope that they can still find survivors under all of this rubble at this point?
Ed, no one really is willing to tell us that they have no hope, but everyone here acknowledges that there's very, very little chance. We're in an area, Ed, between the two towers, what were the two towers. There is a mass of debris here There are no signs of life, haven't been any signs of life in this area for the past several hours. One fireman told us candidly, look, for all intents and purposes, this isn't a rescue effort anymore, it's a cleanup effort. Now, there are hundreds of volunteers here standing by, waiting to save anyone that can be found. I've got an army of doctors and nurses just off to the left, standing by and waiting. So no one's going to say never, but everyone understands what the reality of this scene is.
Thank you, Scott. The latest information we have is that the FEMA has confirmed that they've pulled 40 bodies. 40 bodies have been recovered from the rubble at the World Trade Center. 1,600 people have been treated for injuries. They expect this cleanup to take anywhere from a month to the next 2 to 3 months. Let's go to Bob Orr now in Washington for more news on the air transportation system. Bob?
Well, Ed, in fact, maybe we do have some news. We've got a clarification now that makes some sense from the Department of Transportation. I just got this. I'm going to have to read part of it to you. But Secretary of Transportation Mineta basically has decided to allow a limited reopening of the aviation system, but for one reason only, and that is to allow those flights that were diverted yesterday to go on to their original destinations. Now, as I understand the order, what will happen is passengers who were on the flights yesterday, and only those passengers, no new ones, will be allowed to go back to the airport they were diverted to, reboard the aircraft, and then go on to their original destinations. Beyond that, the temporary ground stop, that is the shutdown of the system, will remain in effect indefinitely. Airlines will be allowed to move around empty planes, but not with passengers on board. And then finally, once all of the new security measures go in place and the system is reopened, these are some of the things that passengers will notice. There will be increased searches of airplanes and airports. There'll be no more curbside check-in. You will no longer allowed to be check-in from, say, an off-airport location like a hotel. There'll be passengers only in boarding areas. There will be no parking near terminals, and all auto traffic near terminals will be severely restricted. So just to recap, for today at least, there may be some flights that take off, but these are flights that had to be diverted yesterday. The only people on those flights will be people that did not get to their original destinations, but no new passengers. Airlines also can move around empty planes, and then we all shut it down again until all the security measures can be ramped up to a point where the aviation authorities are satisfied that all the necessary precautions have been taken. Ed?
Bob, one quick question. So someone who was on a flight, say, from Texas to New York and was diverted to Nashville, will that person be able to continue on the flight to New York, or does that person have to go back to Texas?
No, my understanding is that person, wherever he or she was diverted to, can go to that airport, reboard the original airplane, and go to their original destination, but only that person, no other passengers, Ed.
Thanks, Bob. Let's go now to Russ Mitchell in Midtown Manhattan. Russ, what is the scene there now?
And while parts of New York still look like a ghost town, there are signs here in Midtown Manhattan that things are slowly returning to normal. I'm standing at the corner of 59th and 5th in what is considered, of course, Midtown Manhattan. There's Central Park over there. And you can see folks are out and about. These are tourists. These are native New Yorkers going about their business. Now, the traffic here is not nearly as heavy as it would be normally on a Wednesday afternoon, but it's a lot better now than it was earlier today. To borrow a phrase, a few hours ago, you could have rolled a bowling ball down the street and not hit anyone. Let me walk over here and talk to some folks and get an idea of why they came out today. This is Mike and Donna Greenspan. You guys are native New Yorkers, but you're on vacation from Phoenix, Arizona. What do you think about the resilience of New Yorkers? When you come out today, does it look like things are returning to normal?
It looks to me like things are returning to normal, and it makes me glad to be a New Yorker at heart.
What do you think is going on here? What do you think it's going to take for people to really get their lives back in order here?
Time. I think time. I think we can't forget what happened yesterday. And I think it was wonderful to see the lines at the blood centers. New Yorkers come out. They're resilient.
Thank you so much for talking to us. We appreciate it. I'm going to go over here and talk to Heather and Christopher Berry. They're from Charlottesville, Virginia. They have a really interesting story. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. Heather, let me ask you, you were supposed to be at the World Trade Center yesterday. What happened?
I spent the entire day on Monday at the World Trade Center, and I didn't get to finish shopping, so we were on our way to the World Trade Center. And a kind lady gave me 2 tickets to see Regis and Kelly live, so we were there instead of at the World Trade Center. So it's a very eerie feeling, just the fact we feel that God was watching over us, and it's very scary.
You could have been there. As someone who is not from New York, as you stand here, you sit here today and you see what's going on, how do you feel? What do you see happening in this city?
I feel people are very despondent here. I feel it's just a very scary, very quiet. But I also do say that I feel like New York, people are coming together with a tremendous amount of love, and and I think that's what will put everyone back together, is the amount of love that everyone is showing. People are really reaching out. So I just think it's just a very, very scary thing. And we cannot get a flight home today to get home to our children, so we have arranged for a driver to get us home. So we just want to get home and kind of just take a break.
I understand. Christopher, let me ask you, as you sit down here in the city, what do you see? What do you see in the minds and the eyes of New Yorkers?
I see a lot of people that are scared, and I also see a lot of people who are resilient, and they're bouncing back. Everybody's coming together. I see the whole city coming together, helping out and trying to get through this horrible disaster.
Thank you for talking to us, all of you. Hope you have a safe trip home. We appreciate it. I want to point out, again, I know we've said this earlier in the day, most of the bridges into Manhattan are open. All the tunnels are closed. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani did advise New Yorkers to stay home from work if they could today. When I came into work this morning, it looks like many people heeded that advice because the streets were deserted. Dan, we'll go back to you.
Russ Mitchell, thanks. Now let's go to John Frankel, who's farther south on the island of Manhattan. John, what's the scene?
Well, Dan, in light of what Russ Mitchell just said, most of the businesses down in this area here at North Moore and the West Side Highway are indeed closed. There are not a lot of business people here, but you would think it was a normal day of business because of the congestion on the West Side Highway. And this is really serving as a commuter gateway or checkpoint, if you will, for all sorts of personnel to get down about 5 or 6 blocks south to the site of the bombing. It's firefighters, policemen, sanitation workers, EMT people, also Con Edison people as well, trying to make their way in and out of this area. But right now, a lot of these big rigs and the dump trucks that are going to be used to get a lot of the rubble out of the area can't even make their way down to the site. We also want to raise a point in regards to the firefighters and other rescue workers who we have heard lost their lives. The number now is about 220. We had that confirmed by some people in the police department that there are about 220 rescue workers who lost their lives. And consider this, in the history of the New York City Fire Department, they have had to endure and suffer about 700 losses of life. That's over the course of the New York City Fire Department's history, and in just a 2-hour period, about 220 lost their lives in yesterday's bombing. Dan?
John Frankel, thanks. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Outfit, now estimates that recover and cleanup operations in New York will take 30 to 60 days, with a 10 to 15-day operation probably necessary at the Pentagon. This gives you some idea of the enormity of the job that's still ahead in terms of recovering the dead and searching for those who may still be alive in the rubble. Footnote bottom of the page, at the Defense Department, officials there say that they are convinced that there are no survivors still inside the Pentagon rubble. In New York, there is hope, and yes, realistic hope, that there may yet be additional people found alive as they piece by piece remove the rubble here in New York. Joining us once again as part of our CBS News coverage of Attack on America is our old friend and colleague, CBS News consultant, distinguished professor from Johns Hopkins University, Fuad Ajama. Fuad, would it take a lot of money or not to run this kind of operation?
In terms of what specifically the...
Well, Brad and I have had a friendly disagreement here, but that's not what it's about. We're trying to convey a sense. This seems, on one hand, to have been a very sophisticated operation, right, and it was a fairly big operation, right, when you consider the number of people involved. But Ed's point, and it's a valid point, that it didn't necessarily take a lot of money to carry it off. The only point is that this operation particularly required some financial infrastructure somewhere, and perhaps even larger than Osama bin Laden himself.
But Osama bin Laden himself is a very wealthy man. I mean, this man has had what I call it's affordable radicalism. He was an heir to a giant fortune made in, ironically enough, in Saudi construction money, though he is a sworn enemy of the House of Saud. So I see where the trail now is beginning. There is a suggestion that this is Osama bin Laden plus. Osama bin Laden plus. And there is, if you will, in terms of doing the addition, is Osama bin Laden plus Saddam Hussein. That it is an Osama bin Laden operation. He has the troops, he has the true believers, he has the people willing to die, he has this base of his called Al-Qaeda, he's got these recruits who've been around him, his acolytes, his disciples that hark back to the old Afghan war, and then he would have the diplomatic facilities and the support and the help of Saddam Hussein. The two are not really contradictory, because last night you were talking to Jim Woolsey, the former head of the CIA, and the trail, if you will, some people looking at this trail believe that this couldn't just be Osama bin Laden, that it's just too big for Osama bin Laden. Now, mind you, this is probably too big in terms of the consequences, but the execution of it, let's not lose sight of the simplicity of the execution.
No.
Men with knives and box cutters were the ones who were able to get on these planes. So if you have that, it doesn't really have to be so terribly expensive and so terribly complicated in the planning and the execution stage. We're just horrified by the consequences, because we've had this victory in Bosnia, we had the victory in Kosovo, we had the prior victory in the Gulf War, and it all came on the cheap. We now face this new form of warfare about which you've been talking, and we have these terrible consequences in front of us. So we think it stands to reason, we like to believe, that it can't only be Osama bin Laden, but it could be just that simple.
I don't know whether you heard Bob Schieffer's interview with Richard Shelby, the senator from
I did.
Alabama, and he clearly he walked out of a briefing, gave this interview, and indicated the finger points to Osama bin Laden, perhaps Osama bin Laden plus, but Osama bin Laden, and he also said that the response, echoing President Bush's statement of earlier in the day, that when the response comes, it's going to be it's just going to be some nickel and dime thing. Now, you put all that together, and here's the question. Since the indicator goes to Osama bin Laden's in Afghanistan, places in that part of the world, we know there's a struggle to, in effect, to keep Pakistan, a nuclear power now, from going the way of the Taliban. Is there any way to strike at Osama bin Laden inside Afghanistan and not have Pakistan go the way of the Taliban?
Well, when we venture into the Muslim world, we venture into a part of the world where we stand sentry, but it's a part of the world which is terribly hostile to us. But I think that there is in the region, if you slice the response, even in the last 24 hours, you can see a good deal of nuance in the region. Even the Iranians, our sworn enemies, have condemned these operations and have severe doubts both about Osama bin Laden and about the Taliban. Now, Pakistan is in a very different issue. Pakistan is a land of instability. Pakistan, with or without this crisis, is a regime is on the brink. I think people will get out of the way. They will get out of the way and consider this to be an American operation, and they understand the rules of vengeance in that world. They understand that we have a measure of righteous anger here, that even though we're a liberal society and a bourgeois society and a pluralist society, that we have actually suffered this terrible setback, and that we are entitled, if we so desire, to have it out with Osama bin Laden and with the Taliban. But it will be our burden, our war, our campaign. And frankly, I don't think we should make allowance for their sensibility, because it's not their people who have been hurt. It's not their economy which has been hit. It's not their firemen who have been killed in the World Trade Center. So we serve notice on them that this is an American campaign. We don't need them. It's an operation that we can execute. The Indians and the Pakistanis understand the American rage and the American need for a response to this, and we let them know what we intend to do.
Fuad Ajami, Baghdad, Dateline, the United States is harvesting the thorns that it has planted around the world. Iraqi President Saddam Hussein speaking today. The official Iraqi news agency quotes Saddam as speaking to his top generals about Tuesday's terror attacks in New York, and Saddam Hussein making it very clear that he's delighted with the events that have happened here.
Absolutely. And there is jubilation in Baghdad, there is jubilation in Nablus and Ramallah among some of the young Palestinians. But I think the custodians of power and the moderate people and the middle classes in these societies of the Arab and Islamic world should understand what this campaign is about and should get out of the way and understand what the American response need to be.
We'll see. Thanks, Fuad Ajami. CBS News coverage of the attack on America will continue on many, if not most, of these stations in just a moment. Dan Rather at CBS News World Headquarters in New York with Ed Bradley and Fuad Ajami from Johns Hopkins University. It's 2:30 p.m. here in the East. Headlines of the hour on the attack on America. In the search for clues and evidence, FBI SWAT teams and local police raided a hotel in Boston. They searched a room that may have been used by one or more of those involved in one of the airplane hijack suicide attacks. Here in New York City, a desperate search for signs of life in the rubble and ruins of the collapsed twin towers of the World Trade Center. 41 known, confirmed dead, but thousands of people are still missing a day after the attack. And the current estimates are that this search and rescue operation may require 30 to 60 days in New York. The Federal Emergency Management Operation says that. It also says it may take 10 to 15 days to complete the rescue operation and the cleanup operation at the Pentagon. At the Pentagon, officials do not expect to find any more survivors of the attack there. It is now believed the death toll at the Defense Department will be well below 800, but it may in the final analysis be in what are called now the low hundreds. The FAA ban on air traffic nationwide is still in effect indefinitely, although there's been some confusion and ambiguity about this. Some few exceptions may, please mark the word, be permitted as time goes along. Even so, it may take days to ease the air gridlock and the mass strandings of airline passengers. Improvement of airport security remains a big concern. We'll try to keep you posted as when and if any clarity about what the FAA intends to do comes through. Now, John Roberts is at the White House. John, was interested to hear that Senator Shelby, when he came out of a briefing, was talking even more about indicators pointing to Osama bin Laden, perhaps what we've called Osama bin Laden plus, but pointing increasingly in that direction. Do you hear the same thing where you are?
Well, Dan, late last night, as we reported in our special coverage yesterday, senior administration officials told CBS News that there was good information that Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda group was behind this, though other sources cautioned that information wasn't whole, it wasn't completely sewn together, so take some caution when going down that road, Dan. But there certainly seems to be an emerging consensus here among the national security staff and the administration at large, and even among the leadership of Congress, that in fact there had to be some connection to bin Laden's group. This could have been because of communications intercepts that were picked up yesterday, some of his operatives talking about the attacks, and other indications that they have that bin Laden was responsible. And it would seem, Dan, as well, that coming from the administration at the highest levels, the President and the Secretary of State, that there is at least a program here to try to condition the American people into accepting the idea that there is going to be a strong and punitive response.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I thought what I would do is to update you on the activities of the last several hours since I spoke to the press this morning. Let me begin once again by saying that our hearts go out to all the victims and to their families. It is a tragedy, but as the President has made clear, it is a tragedy that we are strong enough to overcome. Our spirits will not be broken. The resilience of this society will not be broken. We will find out who is responsible for this, and they will pay for it. We are undertaking a full court press diplomatically, politically, militarily, and in the course of the morning and early afternoon, I have been in touch with a number of foreign leaders and international organizational leaders to coordinate the diplomatic approach to this. I have talked to Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the United Nations, and I thank the United Nations for the Security Council resolution they passed, and also for the statement from the General Assembly, and I expect the General Assembly to also work on a resolution later today. Lord Robertson in NATO is hard at work with resolution that is under consideration now that would tee up, if I can put it that way, prime Article 5 responsibilities. Article 5 of the Charter says that an attack from abroad by any one against any member of the alliance is an attack against the alliance. If that resolution goes forward, that doesn't invoke Article 5 yet, but it puts in a position to be invoked when the United States makes a judgment about the nature of the attack and where that attack came from. And I appreciate what Lord Robertson and his colleagues are doing for us. I've also been in touch with Foreign Minister of Belgium, Louis Michel, who is also head of the presidency of the EU at this time, and High Representative Javier Solana, to thank them for the strong support we have received from the European Union and the statements they have made and their cooperation promised to us to deal with this tragedy and to move forward. I've also attended, along, of course, with my other colleagues, the National Security Council meeting with the President, where we reviewed all that has happened and began to make our plans for the efforts we will be taking in the future, not only to bring these perpetrators to not only justice, but to the punishment they deserve, but at the same time to undertake a worldwide effort to build a coalition against all forms of terrorism, wherever it may occur and however it rears its ugly head. This will be a major priority of the administration, and I can assure you it will therefore be a major priority of the State Department. I have also, in the course of the day, spoken to Foreign Minister of Great Britain, Germany, Canada. I have spoken to Foreign Minister Perez twice, Prime Minister Sharon, Chairman Arafat, and Foreign Minister Manley of Canada, if I didn't mention that, Foreign Minister Ivanov of Russia, Foreign Minister Ruggiero of Italy, and I have another number of other calls that are in the process of being made so that we can bring all of this together. And I must say I am deeply touched by the expressions of support I have received from my colleagues. And as I think you all know, the President has been very busy, and I'm sure the White House has announced his 2 phone calls to President Putin as well as to Mr. Chirac, Jiang Zemin, President Jiang Zemin, Prime Minister Blair, Chancellor Schroeder, and Prime Minister Chrétien. So he's spoken to all 5 members, other 4 members of the Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council, and I will leave it to my other cabinet colleagues to talk about the issues under their purview over at Defense, Justice, and FBI. There are, of course, lots of reports and rumors out there, and I think it is wise for all of us to take many of these reports and rumors into some context and perspective. This is also a time, of course, in that regard, for the American people to try, in this time of tragedy, to restore the society to a sense of normalcy. We've got to get back to our jobs. We've got to get back to work. And I know that Secretary Mineta, as soon as it is possible and as soon as it makes sense and is safe, will restore the air traffic system, and commercial air traffic will be brought back online, and I will wait for him to make those announcements with respect to that, and I know that's very much on your mind. Once again, we're building a strong coalition to go after these perpetrators, but more broadly, to go after terrorism wherever we find it in the world. It's a scourge not only against the United States, but against civilization, and it must be brought to an end. I will be delighted to take a few questions.
Secretary, the State Department has been advocating restraint in response to terrorism with the argument that violence only provokes more violence. It's an endless cycle. I wondered if the U.S. will be guided by its own admonition now that the U.S. has been horribly attacked by terrorists.
I think when you are attacked by a terrorist and you know who the terrorist is and you can fingerprint back to the cause of the terror, you should respond.
But
Andrew?
I mean, should it be a limited response, or?
You should respond, whether it's limited or other than limited. You should respond to those who did it, and if you were able to stop terrorist attacks, you should stop terrorist attacks. Andrew?
Secretary Powell, one country you didn't mention was Pakistan, and I understand that your deputy has spoken with the ambassador to Pakistan, and that this evening the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan will be meeting with General Musharraf. What specific steps are you asking Pakistan to take, and have you at all insinuated that if all signs do lead to bin Laden, that the U.S. would take military action against Pakistan and Afghanistan?
Our ambassador is going to be seeing going to be having that meeting that you made reference to. It'll probably not be this evening, more likely tomorrow as a result of schedule problems. But Ambassador Armitage, Deputy Secretary Armitage, did meet with Pakistani officials today, and really to share views We have not made a determination yet as to who is responsible for yesterday's attack. But we thought, as we gather information and as we look at possible sources of the attack, it would be useful to point out to the Pakistani leadership at every level that we are looking for and expecting their fullest cooperation and their help and support as we conduct this investigation and as we generate more information, and to see if they can be helpful in generating information, as well as how helpful they might be if we find a basis to act upon that information. So yes, we are doing what you described with the Pakistanis. Robert?
Just to clarify, when you say you're building a strong coalition to go after the perpetrators, does this mean that you are expecting or hoping that other countries will participate in some kind of military retaliation?
Under Article 5, if we go that far and it actually is executed, then there is an obligation on the part of our NATO allies to assist if we go in this direction. It doesn't mean that they necessarily will participate in the attack, but it makes it easier to obtain support in the way of overflight rights and things of that nature. So but I don't want to get into what we might or might not do and who might go with us and who might not go with us, because that's just too speculative at the moment.
Can I follow that? Having been through the Gulf War as you were, would you hope to build a kind of coalition that extends perhaps beyond NATO and includes perhaps Muslim nations from different parts of the world?
It should include Muslim nations. Muslim nations have just as much to fear from terrorism that strikes at innocent civilians. And I do have a number of calls, and I just haven't connected yet with other leaders in the world representing Muslim populations. As I was coming down, I was waiting to receive a call from Amma Musa, head of the Arab League, and I'll also be talking to my Egyptian colleagues and Jordanian colleagues before the evening is out. Yes, sir.
You have not yet mentioned the point that President Bush made last night, the idea of holding other countries responsible.
Yeah.
This seems to be a dramatic escalation in the U.S. view on how it responds to terrorism. Is that a correct interpretation of it? And as a follow-up, you talk about returning to normal, yet there have been all these mentions of acts of war, the idea that the country is in a war. How can we just return to normal when in a situation like this?
Well, on your first point, I mentioned in my earlier statements, and I will mention it again, that it's not just a matter of going after the perpetrators, but it's going after and dealing with the sources of support that they have, whether that source of support might come from a host country or other organizations that provide them. We have to make sure that we go after terrorism and get it by its branch and root. And so we will hold accountable those countries that provide support, that give host nation, if you can call it that, support and facilities to these kinds of terrorist groups. Now, yes, we believe that acts of war have been committed against the American people, and we will respond accordingly. But at the same time, life has to go on. In all of the difficult times we will be facing ahead, we have to still try to return life to a sense of normalcy. We cannot be a people who are afraid to live. We cannot be a people who will move away from a relatively open society. We cannot be a people who walk around terrified. We're Americans. We don't walk around terrified. We're going to be strong in this difficult period, and we're going to move forward with pride and with determination, and we will get our society back to normal with whatever additional precautions, nevertheless, might be necessary to secure our society without locking ourselves down. Yes, sir.
Secretary Powell, yesterday Senator Graham said that in response to the attacks, he would be willing to reassess the ban on assassinations of foreign leaders. And I was wondering, would you support such a reassessment?
The ban is an executive order, and we have not made such a reassessment, and I'll just leave it there. Yeah. Jane?
India has said many times in the past that Pakistan is harboring terrorism, and there are training camps in Pakistan, and now U.S. officials, including a number of lawmakers here on the Hill, are saying that Osman bin Laden have his training camps in Pakistan, and because he's sending all his, running his empire or terrorism empire from Pakistan. So now, is it time not to go after those countries who are harboring terrorism really? Because how long can we wait, or how many innocent people can we kill?
Well, I don't want to confirm what the Indian government may or may not have said. But as the President said last night, we will be directing our efforts not only against terrorists, but against those who do harbor and do provide haven and do provide support for terrorism. Jane?
Deputy Secretary Armitage heads a task force with the Russians on Afghanistan, where the United States and Russia seem to share some interest. Can this be used as a platform in the coming days? Or
Yes, we're planning to do that.
In what way?
As you know, it's a little difficult to travel right now, but we're looking at ways that...
we break away to check in with CBS News national security correspondent David Martin. David?
Dan, we've been listening to this briefing by Secretary of State Powell, and you can see that this is essentially the same crowd that brought you Desert Storm 10 years ago, particularly Secretary Powell and Vice President Cheney, and of course President Bush, the son of then President Bush. And then there was such a big emphasis on building this international coalition before the U.S. took military action, and you can just see it happening again. The more people you have on your side, the greater your options are in such practical matters as overflight rights, just getting the planes to the target, to actually providing some kind of military support, be it an aerial refueling tanker or whatever. So that seems to be a major theme here. And also there does seem to be this determination not to go off half-cocked and just shoot something up for a feel-good feeling. I think they really, they're talking about going after terrorism root and branch, and that means much, much more than just another strike, a few cruise missiles into a terrorist training camp in the middle of nowhere.
David Martin reporting again live from the Pentagon. We go down to John Roberts, our chief White House correspondent. John?
Well, Dan, if NATO were to invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter, to the best of my recollection, it would be the first time that has happened since NATO was formed in 1949. And as David was saying, would open up a number of different venues, both military and political. France and Germany may be required to put the screws on Saddam Hussein if it indeed is found that Iraq had some culpability in this attack. But more so than that, Dan, I think what Colin Powell is also trying to build here, as well as another military alliance for a possible strike against these terrorists, is the idea of a worldwide coalition, a worldwide consensus to fight terrorism. George Bush, as you know, and this has been used primarily to sell his missile defense plan, has been talking about the new threats of the 21st century at many different stops, not only during the campaign, but now in his 9-month presidency. And Colin Powell saying today that there is a determination by this administration to try to build this coalition against terrorism. But that's not to say also, Dan, that they're not preparing the American people for what may be a fairly large and wide-scale response to these terrorist attacks when it is determined who is responsible. Hear the words of Colin Powell this morning being interviewed on our early show. The American people made a judgment that we are at war, and they want a comprehensive response. They want us to act as if we are at war, and we are going to do that. Those words echoed by the president this morning following a briefing and a meeting of his National Security Council, in which he said the deliberate and deadly attacks which were carried out yesterday against our country were more than acts of terror. They were acts of war. So, Dan, it would seem that there's a program at the highest levels of this administration to steel the American people for what may be an intense and massive response against the perpetrators of these acts.
John Roberts, Buata Jami, seeing retired General Powell in his civilian clothes and his role now as Secretary of State, you couldn't help but think about that time when he said of Saddam Hussein and his army, first we're going to cut off its head, then we're going to kill it.
Yes, that was the moment of innocence. That was a younger Colin Powell, when Colin Powell was a soldier, and when the world was clear, and Saddam Hussein was clear and was a menace to his neighbor. And we assembled this coalition around us, And we actually had many Arab and Muslim participants in our coalition, but they were only a cover for what essentially was an Anglo-American operation for the most part. 10 years, 11 years later, there is an older and wiser and more weary and more subdued Colin Powell, and it tells you something about the difficulty of fighting terrorism as opposed to fighting conventional armies.
Yep.
You also had at that time a very clear, definable target. Absolutely. You knew where he was, you knew where his army was, Absolutely. You knew what you had to do to go and get him.
Yes.
At this point, who do we target?
No, that's exactly right.
And where is he?
And we were all younger, and we remember that war with tremendous clarity. And it was, in the scheme of things, a brilliant victory. I mean, remember, 140 Americans died in the Gulf War. 140 Americans, and a good deal number of them out of friendly fire. Look what we've lost here. So this is not a war. This is a very different kind of war, today's war. We're not really made for this war. This really is neither war nor peace. It's really the twilight war. It's something in the middle. It's something murky, something uncertain.
Twilight war,
Yes.
something murky, something uncertain.
Yes.
Ed Bradley, there has been a school of thought, and it's grown in recent years, that brilliant as the conduct of the Gulf War was on the part of the United States and its allies, that in the end we snatched defeat from the jaws of victory because we left Saddam Hussein in place.
I think that you will find that would probably be the prevailing sentiment among a lot of people, certainly a number of professional military people, that if you wanted to, as you say, cut off the head and then kill it, you need to go get him and cut off the head and kill it. We've tried many times covertly by supporting Iraqi opposition groups to overthrow him without any success at all. Most of them have been killed. We're continuing to supply money to fund these Iraqi opposition groups, but we've had no success in overthrowing Saddam Hussein, and that was the one clear opportunity when you could justify, by military standards and some would say political standards, the theory of hot pursuit. Let's go chase them all the way back to where they came from, which was Baghdad. And let's go in and find Saddam Hussein and let's put him on trial.
Well, we know now he was ready to flee to Sudan or Yemen or someplace.
Yes.
If the military had made the turn into Baghdad, nothing but green lights and blue skies once they won the Battle of the Euphrates Valley. But that's all in the past.
If he had done that, if he had fled because we went after him, he wouldn't be there now.
Well, let's check in very quickly with Wyatt Andrews on the trail of terrorists who got on a plane in Boston. Wyatt?
Dan, recalling that 2 of those 4 hijacked aircraft yesterday originated here at Boston Logan. Let's get up to speed on what has been happening with that intense law enforcement action that played out this afternoon at the Westin Hotel here in the Copley Plaza area of Boston. Here's what we learned from FBI sources. FBI officials made some sort of connection between the flight manifest of those hijacked planes here and names that were registered at that hotel. Our information is that when the FBI squad went in to the Westin at Copley Plaza, they were looking for 3 different names of men described as Arab nationals who were registered in 3 different rooms, and they had registered on the same credit card, which to law enforcement officials raises a flag. The bomb squad went into that hotel at one point, but we are now told that they have left the hotel and that an all clear has been issued on the bomb front. Now, there are a lot of swirling reports of between 1 and 3 arrests. We've confirmed that 1 arrest has been made, but we're told by the FBI advised that the arrests, however many were made, are not in connection with yesterday's events and instead are related to INS immigration actions. There is official confirmation, however, of what we've been reporting all along, and that is that at least 2 of the hijackers who came through the two hijacked airplanes yesterday, at least 2 of them, and it's believed they're connected to the American Airlines flight, began their flight yesterday in Portland, Maine. We get that confirmation from the Chief of Police in Portland, Maine, Michael Chitwood.
I can tell you that there are 2 individuals who are being looked at, and again, this is not confirmed, but being looked at as possibly boarding a plane yesterday morning and flying from here to Boston. Yesterday evening, late night, early morning, Our bomb-sniffing dog was going through the garages and was directed by FBI to go to an automobile which was a 2000 or 2001 Nissan Altima Blue that belonged to Alamo Car Rental. This vehicle was photographed by the Portland Police Department. A cigarette butt was retrieved by one of our evidence people. Both the photographs of the automobile and the cigarette butt were turned over to FBI agents. The vehicle was then transported on flatbed truck to the State Police Crime Lab in Augusta.
One of the more interesting disclosures here at Logan National came from airport officials today who acknowledged that yesterday caught them in the middle of rebadging, a program where, in order to upgrade security, ironically, they were rebadging airport employees. This is certain to turn out to be one of the focuses of the investigation, of course, as the FBI and the FAA look into how these hijackers went through security. The fact that officials have acknowledged they were in the process, they had outstanding upwards of 600 badges that were current but may have been missing, that is certain to factor into the investigation as to how the hijackers were so successful. Dan?
Wyatt Andrews reporting live from Boston. John Roberts has some information at the White House, gives us some perspective on what the president did and why yesterday. John?
Well, Dan, part of the reason why the president flew off to Barksdale Air Force Base and then off to Offutt Air Force Base was because it had been determined by the Secret Service that there was a real and credible threat against the president. And we're beginning to learn a little bit more about this now. Now, we're not sure what the real and credible evidence that the White House is citing is, but the White House press secretary, Ari Fleischer, telling CBS News that they have real and credible evidence, information that the plane that hit the Pentagon was intended for the White House, and that Air Force One was also a target of these terrorists. Now, Dan, we don't know what that real and credible evidence is at this point. They're not talking about the actual evidence. They're saying it's part of the overall investigation. But, Dan, just from an observer's standpoint, the 757 that went into the Pentagon yesterday certainly made a direct hit on the Pentagon, and if the Pentagon was its intended target, it certainly hit the intended target. So we can't speak to the idea that you hit a target directly when you're aiming at another target. There was also this other aircraft that went down in Pennsylvania. Some people have speculated as to whether or not the intended destination of that aircraft might have been the White House or the Capitol building. Now, speaking to the threat against Air Force One, this aircraft is always shadowed by the military. The military knows exactly where it is, and if they don't have fighters off the wings, as they did when it was flying back from Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, they're certainly at the ready to defend the aircraft. But I can tell you from talking to one of my colleagues who was flying on the Air Force One pool yesterday between Sarasota, Florida and Barksdale Air Force Base, that Air Force One did make a rather unusual maneuver. They had been flying across Florida from Sarasota up toward the Jacksonville area, Savannah, Georgia area, and this colleague of mine said that he looked out the window and he saw the Atlantic Ocean, and he overheard one of the Secret Service agents who was on board say, "There's a fifth plane out there." Now, so far, no evidence that there was a fifth plane out there, but a remark heard on board Air Force One that there was a fifth plane out there. Suddenly, Air Force One banked to the left and started gaining altitude. And that's when this colleague of mine said there was a real shock that went through the aircraft. And perhaps, Dan, that may explain some of this real and credible evidence about a threat against Air Force One and the White House that we're hearing from administration officials today.
Reporting live from the White House, John Roberts. Now, the FAA has changed its mind yet again, and let's pause and say they have a very difficult job in trying to sort out what can happen now with air travel. Some flights are now, it is said, going to be allowed to resume, but in the main, the FAA is trying to keep grounded all airline traffic for at least the rest of this day. We'll have more details on this as the afternoon goes along, but just note, in some special cases, the FBI apparently, allegedly, supposedly, and reportedly is now going to allow, after all is said and done, some few flights to get airborne today to resume the flights that were in progress when the terrorist attacks hit. Now, you're watching continuing CBS coverage of Attack on America.